Hi, everyone, and welcome to Book Club Favorites virtual book club discussion. We are live today with two fabulous historical fiction authors to chat about their novels. Today, we are joined by Janet Skeslien Charles, the author of The Paris Library, a gorgeous novel based on the true story of the heroic librarians at the American Library in Paris during World War II. And we have Kristin Harmel, whose newest novel, The Forest of Vanishing Stars, tells the story of a heroine deep in the Eastern European forest who uses her knowledge of the wilderness to help Jewish refugees escape the Nazis. Throughout March, our members were reading both of these World War II historical fiction novels, so we have lots to chat about today. As always, we also have a giveaway running, so be sure to join the conversation and ask a question in the comment section of this video. And doing so will enter you for a chance to win both of these novels, The Forest of Vanishing Stars and The Paris Library. And we also have Caitlin, our marketing expert for the books and historical fiction novel lover, to lead the discussion today. So I will let the three of you head into the discussion now. Thank you all.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Holly. Welcome, Kristin and Janet. It is so nice to have you both here.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Yeah. So we're going to kick off with, I think, one of the best sort of conversation starters when it comes to historical fiction, which is your research. These books are based in reality, right? There's a real war at the core of these, set around these beautiful stories that you've brought out. So can you just tell us a little bit about the process of research, and then maybe just some fun facts or some interesting facts that you found throughout your research? So, Kristin, why don't you go ahead and get us started here?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having us. I love doing events with book club favorites. This is so much fun, and I was such a big fan of the Paris Library, so I'm super excited to be here specifically with Janet today. So, The Forest of Vanishing Stars is set in Eastern Europe during World War II, which for me was a tremendous amount of research just out of the gate, because I typically write about World War II France, as does Janet with this last book. So venturing east to an area I really didn't know was really something I pushed myself to do, because I wanted to do something a little bit outside my comfort zone. But that all had to begin with research. So for me, with any book, the research begins with reading as much as I can get my hands on, just to make sure that there's enough there that I feel like I can kind of base a story around. So in this case, there certainly was. That's how I began. But then it was really important to reach out to as many sources as I could. So two of the people who I think really helped bring this book alive, to kind of give a beating heart to this collection of details that I had assembled and it had sort of my finger on. The two people who really helped me were a man named Vadim Sidorovich, who is a forest guide, an ecotourism forest guide in the very forest I was writing about. I spent countless hours emailing back and forth with him, checking little teeny tiny details. And he would correct things, like I would send him a paragraph and say, have I gotten all the plants right in this paragraph? And he would write back and say, ooh, that flower actually doesn't generally bloom in that part of the forest until 2 weeks later. So, I mean, it was that specific and that accurate, which was so interesting. But he brought the forest alive for me. And then the person who really brought the refugees' stories alive for me, because this is a story basically about Jewish refugees in this particular forest during World War II, was a man who actually was a refugee in that forest. His name is Aaron Bielski. He was 14 when he fled into the woods, and learning his story and hearing it firsthand, I think really gave my story a heart. Did that answer the question?
Yeah, that was really, really lovely. Very interesting that you had to sort of also have like a botanist on hand.
Yes.
Right? What interesting things that you have to go through for your fiction.
So
Janet, how about you? What about your research process, and then any sort of fun tidbits about that?
Thank you for having us both. This is so exciting to be here. I love The Forest of Vanishing Stars, and the research was amazing. As a reader, I love the author's notes, and to know that you talked to Mr. Bielski for this book, Kristin, wow, that gave me chills. And when I was writing this book, I have to say it started off at work. I worked at the American Library in Paris as a programs manager. So each week I organized events with authors and journalists and artists who presented their work at the library. And I sat across the aisle in the back office from an Italian gentleman who had worked at the library since the Nixon administration. And so he knew everything about the history of the library. And he and another colleague were talking about librarians in the past, because my colleague was getting ready to do a presentation about them. And so that really struck my curiosity. And I'm really grateful that I worked in an office in a open space, because you know, when you work in an open space, you hear everything. So whether you want to or not, but this, I was really, my curiosity was piqued. And so I looked up Dorothy Reeder, who was the director of the American Library in Paris during World War II. And on the American Library Association archive site, I found a 15-page confidential report that she wrote about the days right before the occupation and during the occupation. And it gave me chills, just like when I read Kristin's author's note, I had chills. And I thought, if I can make someone feel those same chills as I write Dorothy Reeder's story, I'll be really, really happy. And so from there, I wrote to the American Library Association and asked for all the correspondence to and from Dorothy Reeder. So it was thousands of pages scanned. It was just really fascinating to read her voice, to read her challenges. And I was really lucky because I had a student when I arrived in Paris around 2000, and she was a Jewish résistante. And so she was 80 years old, and she was scrawny as a day-old chicken wing, regal as a She had a bottle of champagne in her refrigerator just in case. And I really loved talking to her. She had a medal after the war that she showed to me once. It was super tiny. It was in paper because they didn't have the metal to make the actual medals. She just was an amazing woman. And then later on here in Paris, I volunteered with a program that pairs people with elderly neighbors. And so I talked to another woman who had lived through the war. And so those two experiences were really incredible. I also read a lot of memoirs written by women during the war, from a French madam who had Nazi clients to an American married to a French man who was called up. And so she followed him from base to base at the beginning of the war. And so it was just really, I think Kristin could probably say one thing leads to another, and it's fascinating. Yeah. Sometimes it's hard to know when to stop even.
Yes. That's maybe the hardest part of the research, just saying like, okay, I'm done. I have enough, because you never do.
So I'm going to throw an audience question out, because I think that's a very a great one to add here. So Micah asks, when writing books about war, does the process make you emotional? It seems like you both were able to meet with perhaps people who were there, or at least experts in the area. Does it, when does it hit home? When does it make you emotional? Give us a little bit of feedback on that idea. Kristin, why don't you go ahead and give us
Sure. Yes, absolutely. And that's such a great question, Micah. That's something I haven't been asked before. It makes me tremendously emotional. And I think that if it doesn't, maybe you're not doing it right. That doesn't sound right. But I just feel like you need to connect deeply with the characters you're writing about. And if you're putting them in a situation where they're going through very difficult, very life-changing, very heartbreaking events, you need to be there with them. And so for me, especially, sometimes the scenes you're writing during a day don't necessarily touch on the war or touch directly on the war. And those days are a little bit easier. But the days you have to write a really difficult scene that really puts them up against what's happening in history, and that really forces them to do things that make us all a little bit uneasy. Those are really emotionally taxing days. I feel very drained when I walk away from writing days like that. And I think it gives you empathy for what people are going through currently in areas of the world that are currently at war.
And Janet, how about you?
I don't think I realized at the time what a toll it took on me. I think looking back on it now, I realized I was probably a little depressed for a few years because you're really in the darkest part of humanity. And for those of you who've read my book, you know that I talk about these crow letters where neighbors, family members, colleagues denounce Jewish people. And so I went to the Holocaust Museum here in Paris and went through their archives and read all of these horrible, horrible letters. And just to realize that people can do that to each other, it's really painful to read. It's painful to think about. And it feels a lot more personal than the battlefield because you're denouncing neighbors, you're denouncing colleagues, you're denouncing sometimes people who've married into your family. So it really, yes, it really is challenging. And I think I may be more emotional now than I was during the writing of it when I see what's happening in the world. And I wrote a book set in Ukraine. My first book was set in Ukraine. And so I have a real soft spot and a real love of the people. So I think now I'm even more emotional, if that makes sense.
Yeah. You know, feeling a little bit more of a personal connection to it. Well, to sort of shift here a little bit, we can talk about something that we love in the Paris Library, which is books on books, right? We love to read about libraries. We love to read about reading as readers. And I think that we often take such refuge in books and particularly in libraries. So talk, Janet, just a little bit about sort of as a writer and I'm sure as a reader, just, you know, what maybe kind of joy it brings you to write about writing or write about reading rather, and write about books and what kind of power that they can have in scary situations.
I think we all have a book that really saved us or a librarian who saved us growing up. And so it's really exciting to think that we might through talking about books and sharing the importance of books, talking about our favorite books, maybe share that love, maybe share that that optimism and that hope. We were talking about something pretty dark earlier, but I think really books really are a refuge, and they're proof that people are thinking, proof that people care, and put so much love out into the world. People read because they're interested in the lives of others. And so it was really wonderful to be able to write about the library. I loved trying to describe the library, to try to find its absolute essence, whether it was describing colleagues or the books or the patrons of the library. It was really one of the joys of writing this book.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Kristin, a response from you sort of as a fellow reader, and I know that you have written sort of, you know, books on books in the past, you know, what your sort of joy is in writing about reading and writing.
Well, it's such a good question. And Janet, your answer was perfect. You know, I think, as Janet said, all of us who read books have a passion for books and have found our way into books because of a book that helped us, or a librarian that helped us, as Janet said. So I think we all kind of have that in common. And, you know, when you pick up a book to read, you want to see a little bit of yourself in that book, I think, right? Even if you're reading about a completely different time and place, the thing that connects us to the book is being able to imprint yourself on those characters or in that time period, or feel like you understand what they're going through. And I think that writing about books is one way to do that, because that's a connection we have to people who existed in a different time and place. If I'm reading the Paris Library, I'm reading about other people who value the written word and value libraries and value reading and value books. And that draws me in even more as a reader, because I can look at those people and say they existed in a different time, they existed in a different culture, but at their core, they're just like me. And I think that's powerful. And I think it's something that readers really are drawn to in books about books.
Yeah, I think both of you definitely bring up some great points. So now we're going to delve into sort of the worlds of each of these books. you talked a little bit about, Kristin, sort of how much research you did on making the forest, right, and creating a real live experience of the forest. Can you talk sort of a little bit about sort of, the safety of the forest, the scariness of the forest, sort of all of those things, as the book goes on, and sort of how Yona relates to it and her relationship with it?
That's a great question. And, writing about this forest was one of the things that both appealed to me and terrified me in undertaking this book. I mentioned earlier that writing this book was a little bit pushing myself out of my comfort zone. I had gotten very comfortable writing about France during World War II, and I needed to do something that shook me up a little bit. I would say that one of my shortcomings as a writer, or maybe not shortcomings, but something I don't do as naturally out of the gate, is writing setting. Because I'm so much more interested in the dialogue and the personal interaction that sometimes I have to kind of go back and fill in that stuff on the second draft. So to start with something that I knew that the setting actually had to become a character was a challenge to me. And I kind of thought of it like how people always say about Sex and the City that New York was a character, right? New York itself was a character in Sex and the City. I bet you didn't think I was going to bring up Sex and the City in a historical fiction discussion. But, New York itself is a character, and I wanted to do that here. And having this forest that protected, sustained, and betrayed the people hiding within it was fascinating to me, because these people needed the forest, but the forest also turned its back on the people from time to time. It saved them, but it also put them in peril. I was just endlessly fascinated by that, and by the opportunity to write this piece of nature as kind of a living, breathing character that changed the world around them. And as I mentioned, I don't think I could have done that without the help of Vadim Sidorovich, the forest guide, who has written books about the Nalibaki forest, who has a PhD, and was so kind to spend his time. I mean, I would send him 20 questions at a time, and he would send me back pages and pages of response. And if he felt like I wouldn't understand exactly what he was saying, he would go into the forest and take pictures of the things he was talking about, or take pictures of himself doing the things. So he would take pictures of himself in an old hollowed out tree trunk to show me that you could fit 3 men across in it if you needed to hide. He took pictures of old mud brick molds from the 1930s and 1940s so that I could kind of wrap my head around how you would have built a mud brick stove to stay warm for the winter in the forest. So there were a million things like that he kind of breathed life into, and I was able to hopefully take that extra step and give that forest life as a character.
Yeah. Yeah. And so from the outdoors, indoors, Jen, I love in the book, we sort of like meet the library, before turmoil, right? And sort of, get settled into it, into the characters and into the library itself, right? Into the settings. And then danger and turmoil arrives. So talk again a little bit about, sort of the process of the library over time, or how it maybe changed to the characters over time.
Well, speaking of change, I will say one thing that I loved about Kristin's book is how Yona's confidence in herself and in her knowledge of the forest, how I felt like that was another element of the forest too, and was really amazing. It really added to her character and her growth, and just watching her blossom, just like you mentioned earlier, the flowers blossoming at certain times in the forest. I thought that was really beautiful to read about. And Caitlin, I think you're right. We see the library at first kind of through a rosy light before the war, and how things are. And it was really a pleasure to research libraries. I actually read a couple years of the magazine Library Journal to find out what librarians were concerned about. And for example, I learned a lot of times they turn to department stores to ask about customer service. I learned that there were germaphobes who were worried about, checking out books and getting germs from books at the time. I kind of think of that as like a modern thing that we deal with. So it was very interesting to research libraries and to try to make them come alive. There was an article about how people ask for the book Grapes of Wrath um, um, the grape of Gabe, or the rape of Wrath. All of these cute little librarian stories that I try to put through in the book, and really make the library a character of itself, and then to show the breakdown of relationships as the war went on and people became tense and angry. It was really a challenge to build something up and then kind of maybe break it down.
Yeah, for this sort of rosy colored glasses, like you're saying, to sort of the reality of, where everybody was and what was going on around them. I'm going to pull out another audience question because I think this is a really interesting one. Susan asks, what's your favorite part of the writing process? The sort of research, right? You're getting all of your plotting and planning, or the actual sitting down, the writing, the editing, that sort of process. And then sort of to follow up, she asks, like, when do you know it's time to stop the research and start writing, your characters and your plot and kind of getting down to actually creating a story? Or do you do both simultaneously? Are you sort of, your research is always going on, but perhaps you've already got your little nugget of an idea and are sort of starting to get that thought process going? Janet, why don't you jump us off with that one?
Oh, I never stop.
Research or writing?
Oh gosh, I never stop researching. I just had an article published in the Chicago Tribune about one of the librarians who was from Chicago and who worked at the American Library in Paris and then disappeared during World War II. So that just, I handed in my manuscript in 2019. So that just goes to show how fascinated I still am with the librarians of that time and with the people who worked at the library. I think it's very hard to stop caring or just to move on to the next project. And but it's also risky because you can do not too much research, but you can neglect the writing. You can research forever and then never actually write your story, which I do see some people do. So I think you really have to be strict with yourself and say, from this time to this time, I will write this day, and then maybe do research in the evening or in the afternoon, but really dedicate specific time to writing. Otherwise, you can just research forever. And then that's reading other people's work when you should be maybe working on your own.
Yeah, that's a good point. For me, and I've never put it like this before, but I was just thinking now as I was listening to you, for me, I feel like the research is like when you're falling in love, right? Like you can't get enough of it. You want to be with the research all the time. You want to tell everybody about the research. It's just like if you have like a new boyfriend, right? And then I feel like for me, the first draft is like you're a newlywed. Like you've just gotten married, like you're excited about it. You're kind of all in, like everything's happy. There's a few little bumps in the road, but like it's easy to work through them. And then I feel like the editing process is like you've hit your first real bump in the road in your marriage, and you're like in counseling, and you've got to work your way through it or something. So they're all, to me, they're all just such different pieces of the process. And the falling in love process, the research, I love doing the research. It's when I get excited about the book. It's when the idea for the book is kind of forming in my head. So it's a very creative time for me, even though I'm reading things other people have written, or, watching interviews with people or calling people up and talking to them. Because the more I take in, the more my little writer brain is working. And I'm thinking like, ooh, I could use that there. Or, oh, this opens up a whole new plot door, or like a set of options that I hadn't thought about. Then when you sit down to write, it's very exciting because all these things that have been in your head, now is your chance to put them on the page and develop the characters and see them kind of come alive in this world that you're creating. But I do continue to do a little bit of research, a lot of research during that stage. And then my least favorite stage of it is probably editing, because you just feel like, at least for me, I feel like I've just emotionally poured everything out. And like, now you want me to fix it? Like I have to make it better? Like, what are you talking about? This is like my passion. I don't know, whatever. So that is difficult for me, but there's a lot of research at that stage too, because I want to make sure that I'm getting everything absolutely correct. And sometimes when you're writing a first draft, you gloss over things that you're going to come back to later, because you want to get it correct, but you don't want to stop the creative process in the middle.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. So we have another audience question. Mary Rita asks, is there anything that you couldn't find that you wish you could find? Any source material or item of research that you just couldn't track down that you wish you had more specifics about. Kristin, why don't you get us started on this one?
Yeah, that's a great question. For the Forest of Vanishing Stars, I feel like that was probably my most research-intensive book that I've written so far. So I feel like I did manage to get my hands on most of what I needed. I think something I would have liked a little bit more clarity on is the idea that there were 1,200 people hiding in this forest as part of a single group, and they disappeared. They managed to disappear. They managed to evade the Germans for 2 years, more than 2 years. And I think I would have liked a little bit more clarity on how a group that large manages to disappear that successfully. I understood, I would say, 95% of it. But in cases where, for example, there were German planes flying overhead, I guess I would have liked a little bit more detail that I could not find about exactly how they stayed concealed when they were walking out in the open. So that's something I wish I had a little bit more of a handle on. But I think I did the best I could do to kind of fill in with what I did know, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. And how about for you, Janet? Is there anything, that you just couldn't track down?
Well, I will say thank goodness for typewriters. I am so glad that all of my characters, my real life characters, typed letters, made carbon copies. I will be forever grateful to them. Thank goodness for archivists. Thank goodness for librarians who save all of these works for us. I was able to get everything I wanted and more. I will say that the book I'm working on now is set in World War I, and I'm writing about someone who's not rich and famous. And so she doesn't have archives, and I only have one photo of her. And so it is really frustrating to go from a project where there was so much information to very little information.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's so interesting. That to have to sort of go between the two. You've got the totally good. I've got it, and now enough. So we just have time for one last question. And so we'll do. I just want to. Both of you are sort of big Parisian fans. Paris, Janet, you are there now. But give me each of you your sort of what's the must-see, perhaps a little under the radar, that you would say, when you go to Paris, this is the place to be. Kristin, why don't you start us off?
Well, actually, let Janet start on that one, and then okay. I will chime in.
Okay, Janet, yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Well, my favorite place in Paris is the Red Wheelbarrow Bookshop. Ooh. And so my advice would be to go to the Red Wheelbarrow Bookshop, get a book, and then go to the Tres Bakery, just a few doors down, and have a wonderful coffee and dessert, and then go for a walk in the Luxembourg Garden and maybe read your book in the Luxembourg Garden and just enjoy. So it's just three places all next to one another, but just nourishment and sunlight and a good book.
Oh man,
sounds ideal.
I'm so jealous that you're there right now. That's I haven't been to Paris in a few years, and one of the things Janet and I have talked about before is that I used to live there, but I used to live in the same building as the American Library in Paris, which is such a great coincidence. So I feel I feel, Janet, like it's strange that we have never encountered each other in the streets of Paris before. Perhaps we have, and we just didn't know. For me, Paris is all about getting lost and just walking. I think I think Janet's suggestion was an excellent one, and I will absolutely do that the next time I am in Paris. I like to go to Paris without a plan. I feel like I've had the privilege of having lived there, of having returned many times. I've done a lot of the touristy things, which I think you should do if it's your first trip to Paris, but then just walk. I mean, it's just one of those beautiful cities where you'll discover something new around every corner. Walk and eat. That's my other big Paris talk tip. Just eat. I mean, the food there is phenomenal. And whether you find your way to a market street like Rue Claire and get something fresh, or try one of the amazing restaurants or cafes or whatever, it is just a city that I miss absolutely every day. And Janet, I'm coming to visit. I hope you have space on your couch for me.
I would love that.
Oh, Holly, we can't hear you.
Can you all hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, you're good.
Sorry about that. I just wanted to pop in. I apologize, but we are all out of time for our historical fiction book club chat today. It has been wonderful having both Kristin and Janet to discuss both of their historical fiction novels. And Caitlin, thank you so much for prompting this discussion. As a last reminder, everyone can still ask questions in the comment section of these videos to enter for a chance to win both the Paris Library and the Forest of Vanishing Stars. So if you haven't read both of these books yet, you will not be disappointed. These are both fabulous, beautiful reads about true world happenings set in World War II. So thank you again to both of you, to all of you for this great discussion. Book Club Favorites will be back next month to read Jennifer Egan's newest novel, The Candy House. So be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, check out our site to follow along with all the book club resources and recommendations, and prepare for our next discussion together. So thank you all, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.